University of Melbourne, which is a peculiar hybrid position. It's a bit like being resident provocateur and court jester all in one. I'll do the acknowledgement of country in a moment, but could I first ask you as a courtesy, please check your telephones. There's a bucket of water here for the first one that rings. You don't want it to be yours. And the format of this evening is very straightforward. Sharon Lewin and Peter Doherty, and I'll introduce them formally in a moment, will answer some of my questions, but then they'll also answer yours, and we'll have some roving mics when we get to that point. And I'd ask you when we do get there to think about asking a question. We don't really want life stories and songs and poems. We want questions. And if you could address your question to one or the other of them rather than both, that would be terrific as well. But without any further ado, there's a new acknowledgement of country prescribed by the university. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live. The Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples from Buruli, Fisherman's Bend, Parkville, South Bank and covering the Werribee campus as well, and the Yorta Yorta Nation for the Dookie and Shepparton campuses, and the Dja Dja Wurrung people for the Creswick campus are all embraced by this acknowledgement. And we're grateful to the traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who have been instrumental in our ongoing journey of reconciliation. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways right across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back, as we now know, more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to elders past, present and future and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge within the Academy of the University of Melbourne and of course its affiliates such as the Doherty. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we're privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners, and in making this acknowledgement of country, we commit to respectful and responsible conduct towards all others, according to the traditional laws of this land, particularly at times of formal ceremony. There are some VIPs to acknowledge as well, and in particular, the Minister. Thank you very much, Marianne Thomas, Minister for Health, Health Infrastructure and Ambulance Services, and the Shadow Minister, Georgie Crozier, Shadow Minister for Health and Ambulance Services. Dr. Amanda Caples, Victoria's lead scientist, and Dr. Claire Looker, Victoria's Chief Health Officer. Mr. Jeremy Moule, Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and Tim Ader, Secretary for the Department of Jobs, Skills, Industry and Regions. Mr. Ewan Wallace, Secretary of the Department of Health, Professor Shelley Dolan, CEO of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, Mr. Martin Meyer, Chair of the Doherty Institute Council, and Professor James Angus, Board Chair of the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics. Now, as most of you will be aware, the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, which we will call the Doherty Institute, is an unincorporated joint venture of the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And under the expert guidance of Director, University of Melbourne Professor Sharon Lewin, who we will hear from, the Doherty Institute is now home to more than 1,000 staff and students who specialise in infection and immunity spanning research, public health and education. And we have this extraordinary precinct in this city of Melbourne where we embrace the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, the Florey, the Murdoch, soon the Burnett, CSL, the Royal Children's, the Royal Women's, the Royal Melbourne, the VCCC, or Peter Mac as it used to be known, and of course the Medicine, Dentistry and Health Science faculty of the University of Melbourne, which gives Melbourne, the city of Melbourne, the state of Victoria, it gives a combined heft, a research heft, that is exceptionally rare in this whole world. There's only a few places where this stuff happens. It is really quite incredible. It would be great to be able to stand here and say that it was all planned that way. But in fact, it's grown organically, which is even more extraordinary, and something that everyone who's played a role in it, no matter how humble a role, everyone should be proud of. Of course, it's named in honour of our Nobel laureate, Professor Peter Doherty, who we'll hear from, and the vision is to improve health globally through discovery, research, and the prevention, treatment, and the cure of infectious diseases. Now, soon we will hear from the wonderful Peter Doherty and the wonderful Sharon Lewin. Please, could you welcome them? Peter is the patron of the Institute, trained initially as a veterinarian. He's an Australian immunologist and pathologist who, with Rolf Zinkernagel of Switzerland, received the Nobel Prize for Physiology of Medicine in 1996 for their discovery of how the body's immune system distinguishes virus-infected cells from normal cells. After leading a research laboratory at the Wistar Institute, Philadelphia, and teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, Peter headed the Department of Experimental Pathology at the John Curtin School of Medical Research in Canberra and served as chair of the Department of Immunology at St Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, where he still holds the Michael Tamer Chair of Biomedical Research. But then in 2002, he joined the Faculty of Medicine at the Uni of Melbourne and from 2014 has been at the Doherty Institute. After working on infection and immunity at one level or the other for 60 years, he's moved to emeritus status at the University of Melbourne in July 2023. This is not in the notes, but I'll add it on. He is, without doubt, the best science communicator that we've got. Peter, thank you for all that you've done. Sharon Lewin is the inaugural director of the Doherty Institute. She's also an infectious diseases physician and basic scientist. There's nothing basic about the science that she does. Director of the Cumming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics and Melbourne Laureate Professor at the Uni of Melbourne. Her research focuses on understanding why HIV persists on treatment and developing clinical trials aimed at ultimately finding a cure for the HIV infection. And indeed, I'm reading my copy of The Economist a few weeks ago, and there she was, featured in that global magazine. It was wonderful to see. Sharon's a leading global expert in HIV science, is the immediate past president of the International AIDS Society, and she's received numerous awards, including being appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in recognition of her distinguished service to medical research, to education, and to clinical care in the field of infectious diseases, particularly HIV and AIDS. But before we get into our conversations, and I invite them up to the chair, we have a short video to explain a little more about the Doherty Institute.
I do remember how we were all excited moving across from the Melbourne University campus to the brand new Doherty. We all felt like the sky was the limit here. Happy 10th birthday, Doherty Institute.
The Doherty Institute is an unincorporated joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital.
The vision is to improve health globally through discovery science and the prevention, treatment and cure of infectious diseases.
It was a new idea to bring together the available talent in this part of Melbourne, the sort of intellectual cutting edge, and the people who are actually dealing with real infectious diseases.
When I learned of the vision to put all of those elements in one building, I needed no convincing. I wanted to be part of it. The first 10 years of the Institute have shown what's possible.
We've had several breakthroughs to really understand the role of killer T cells in providing us protection from influenza viruses.
In the area of antimicrobial resistance, we've had a huge impact.
The Doherty Institute has actually been recognised as a global leader in pathogen genomics.
Solving the 80-year transmission mystery of Buruli ulcer gave us a tool to control the infection.
The breadth of capability in influenza is truly incredible.
We established the Staphylococcus aureus network adaptive platform trial, clearly the largest ever clinical trial for this infection that's ever been conducted.
But without a doubt, the success I'm most proud of is our response to COVID.
The achievement of growing SARS-CoV-2, there was a lot of media attention, being the first laboratory outside of China to grow the virus, to help other labs all around the world respond on all fronts.
Being involved in helping to set the national vaccine threshold targets for Australia. The beginning of COVID was pulled in to key national policy advisory committees, helping to think through how quantitative methods and models could be used to help address these emerging questions. Talking to people, they were very envious of my position of being here in the Doherty with everybody else in the house.
Over a matter of a couple of weeks, we were able to set up surveillance for all hospitalised cases of COVID-19, in addition to monitoring vaccination status and treatment data.
And we were world first to describe immune responses in a COVID patient.
The other thing that came through during the pandemic was helping the Pacific Island nations. We had a great outreach to them through various mechanisms.
The Institute came together in a way that I probably never could have imagined. The generosity of people, the hard work that people put in at that time, all of the expertise that we drew on from our staff, immensely proud. How have we been able to achieve success? It's because of the brilliant people that work here.
Since childhood, I dreamed of being a scientist, and now I lived my dream.
We've got over 200 graduate researchers here at the Doherty Institute. They come from all corners of the globe, which I think is a really good reflection on just how internationally renowned we are as an institute. I was taught all by scientists and researchers that are based here at the Doherty.
Teaching at the Doherty Institute is a privilege. Looking back on what we achieved, I think it's been very satisfying.
The Doherty really provides the supporting, nurturing environment that we can do the best science.
It takes more than the scientists. The administrative staff, people who wash glassware, people who clean the floors, those people take pressure off the scientists. No great institution works without great people. This institute is a frontline institute that will always need to be prepared and have the best available talent. So for the future of the Institute, it's enormously important we maintain that collegiality, because collegiality is what works great in science. We talk to each other, we interact with each other, we build on our strengths.
So what do I see in the next 10 years and beyond? Well, I think controlled human infection models are really powerful.
The coming Global Centre for Pandemic Therapeutics, what an incredible opportunity that is.
Receiving this grant with the coming Global Center for Pandemic Therapeutics allows me to contribute directly to the advancement of novel therapeutics for respiratory diseases.
I'm very excited about the Australian Institute for Infectious Diseases. This institute will facilitate vaccine research not only in Australia but also in global health settings.
I'm also really excited to see some of these exciting new emerging technologies such as metagenomics.
We have a real opportunity to bring all of these elements together and go much more quickly from here's a problem in infectious diseases to here's a solution.
It's been a pleasure working here for this last 10 years. I certainly look forward working here for another 10 years.
I get up every morning looking forward to coming to work.
Happy birthday, Doherty Institute.
Sharon and Peter, thank you both very much, and we'll get to talk about that culture, that collegial culture, in due course, but let's start off with some of the beginnings. Sharon, take us through how it was cobbled together in those first days. How did the Doherty get its start?
Well, first of all, welcome, and thank you very much, Jon, for doing this, and how exciting to be here 10 years in. Can't believe it's taken... We've gone that far. Well, I wasn't there at the very beginning, but I'll tell the story. There were many people in the room that were, and the WHO Collaborating Centre for Influenza, which is within the Doherty Institute, it's one of 5 centres globally that traces strains of influenza and tells us what strain should go into the vaccine every year, had previously been at CSL. And it was unable to stay at CSL, so there was a tender for where it should go because it needed to move out of CSL. And the Royal Melbourne Hospital put in a bid. It was led by Mike Catton, who's in the room. I saw Mike earlier. And the university put in a bid, led by Jim McCluskey. And the Royal Melbourne won. And as I said a few weeks ago, Jim McCluskey never likes losing a battle. And Jim, of course, turned this into a positive and thought, well, why are we competing against each other? We're across the road. Let's get together and form something much bigger in partnership, bring all the different departments from infectious diseases across the University of Melbourne and Royal Melbourne Hospital and put them in one institute. And I think they had the idea at the time to call it the Doherty Institute. And it was an idea in the bottom drawer of future strategic plan of what could be done for the different departments, many of whom needed a new home. And then the global financial crisis hit in 2007, and the federal government was looking for a big project. And so the federal government, the state government, the University of Melbourne all chipped in to build the building, and it opened in 2014. I was recruited in 2014, so I missed all the old action, but that's the brief story of how it came about.
And briefly, the relationship between the two stakeholders, the university and the hospital. I'm sure it's absolutely perfect. There's never any tension, there's never any stress. Is that right?
It's remarkably good, and I'm being very honest about that. We brought together about 6 departments who had very different histories, cultures. A scientist, a researcher has a very different culture who's working on, asking very fundamental questions about discovery science, to someone that's pressured to run 50 tests in a day, who's at the front line of a public health reference laboratory, to a clinician that's seeing someone very sick in intensive care unit. These are all the different people that are in the institute. And they've all got different cultures, all got different histories, but yet people really did come together. And I actually have to say, although hospitals have very different pressures and cultures, and universities have very different goals, hospitals tend to be much more local, universities much more global. The marriage has been pretty good, I would say, and it has been very, very collegial. People really wanted to make it work, and it's a really unusual model for a research institute. There aren't any others like that, at least in Victoria.
So, Peter, the vision as you saw it and the necessity for an institute like this, how do you describe that? What's the mission?
I thought it was...
Get the microphone up close to your mouth,
please. It was an absolutely brilliant idea to bring together areas, the basic biomedical research that goes on in the university department, the diagnostic facilities in Victorian, the various government agencies that are funded through Melbourne Health that actually look at community health, diagnosis, medicine and all the rest of it. And to bring all those things together, I don't know of it. There's not another institution in Australia that does that. In fact, I don't really know that there are many worldwide. One would be CDC in Atlanta, I suppose. So, and it's worked remarkably well. When I first saw the job description for the director running an institute, which is partly University of Melbourne, and universities are pretty odd creatures, I can tell you, and Jon will tell you more about that, no doubt. And then from the hospital, state government and so forth, I thought, how's this going to work? It's going to be like herding cats. We've heard a lot about cat ladies from J.D. Vance, Vice President candidate. But
I wasn't expecting honestly, him to get a mention tonight.
Sharon is the premier cat lady. And basically, it's worked brilliantly. But the reason it's worked brilliantly, and Sharon is enormously talented, is that we've had such a buy-in from everybody who came into it. Everyone was committed, and then we've had this tremendously collegial culture where people support and benefit each other. This is a bit Victoria, if I may say. So I'm a Queenslander, so I can say that. But Geoffrey Blaney, many years ago, made the point that Victoria and Melbourne actually works better together than any other state. And the reason for that is everyone supports AFL. Now, I grew up in Brisbane, which is rugby league, rugby union. The two don't talk to each other. And Sydney's impossible, of course. It's full of well, we won't go into that.
No, we won't. We won't. And Sharon, I'll refer you to some defamation specialists for being called a cat lady later on. Was it, just briefly though, Peter, was it a moment's hesitation in lending your name. You've been asked since the Nobel Prize, you've been asked countless times, and there's a steady stream of requests and invitations. So how long did you have to think about this one?
No, there was no hesitation in it, though. I wondered what I was getting into. Normally you don't get anything like this named after you until you're dead. And I'm past my use-by date, but not yet quite there. But I suggested, I'd worked a long time in the United States. I spent more than 20 years off and on in the United States. And the model there is you name something after somebody who gives you a lot of money. Now, I suggested the Pratt Institute or the Fox Institute. I don't think I suggested Gina Reinhardt, but they were adamant about this, and so I said, yeah, fine. I had no idea what I was getting into, though. I mean, I'm the patron. I mean, you think your status in the university is equivocal. What the hell is a patron? As far as I can work out, it's somebody who does what they're told when they're told to do it, and Sharon has a charming way of doing that.
The statue comes later. Sharon, turning the vision into reality, there's 10 years to look back on, but setting that culture, that tone, and getting the wheels moving, what did you have to do?
Well, I think there was a few key components to the story, which of course changed a lot during COVID, but the first one was a single brand of people buying into being part of something bigger than they were before, and a single brand. And even though, of course, we're very tied to the university and the hospital, and everyone is employed by either of those state joint venture partners, the single brand was very, very important, and a single vision. And so we did the usual things that people do in establishing a new institution around a strategic plan, a vision, a mission.
A logo.
And consistent use of that brand, I think, was very, very important. People may not think it is, but it actually really is. And we spent a lot of time on this. We did all these focus groups. If you're winning a Nobel Prize, what would the banner look like behind you? Would it be the university, the hospital, the institute? And that paid off enormously when COVID came, because within the institute we have got little departments, we have got very different cultures and histories, and we've got very different disciplines. But when COVID came, I think it was obvious that we had end-to-end capability of what was needed to respond to a pandemic, and whether it was an epidemiologist, a clinician, a immunologist, a vaccinologist, they would use that continual association with the Doherty. So that was really important. There were other things like seed grant funding, trying to stimulate people to work together. I think that was very beneficial. And then trying to look across the whole institute with some broad themes that brought people together.
And bringing together a lot of different disciplines within the scientific community. Is there a pecking order, officially or unofficially?
Well, there's huge cultural differences between clinicians and fundamental scientists, and I cross that divide a bit because of my background as a clinician scientist. And there is a pecking order, but different people have different pecking orders. So when I actually took on the job, I really wanted the culture of the Doherty to be a bit like a public hospital, because I'd spent really my entire career in a public hospital, where I knew a cleaner or a ward clerk would be just as proud of a new neurosurgical technique as the neurosurgeon that was on the front page of the Age. I sort of wanted that type of culture in the institute.
Why?
Because I wanted every single person there to feel proud that they were working in that place and understood what other people were doing.
Why?
Well, I think it motivates people, and it gives better outcomes. People are happy coming to work, and I think we achieved it in COVID, because suddenly the fundamental immunologists, and there are many brilliant ones in the room, including one sitting right up here with me, they suddenly realised, oh wow, developing that test for COVID in January 2020, diagnosing the first case, that was really important. And then the epidemiologists could see that the first description of the immune response to COVID was going to lead to ideas around vaccinations. People really got it in COVID, and I really do think that our cleaner that is there every morning making sure that the institute looks great felt proud over that time, and that was very important to me.
Yeah, and so you've created, and you talked about the brand. That's a brand that has a status you can't buy. You've established
we also have Peter Doherty behind the brand. That's pretty precious too.
Yeah, but as he said himself, he's past his use-by date. So, but that culture that you've created, it's the opposite of the hierarchical model that so much medicine depends upon. Were there some people who were a bit put out when you asserted that?
Well, it wasn't
the hero
me.
model.
Yeah, it wasn't me, of course, that created it on my own. I mean, there were many fantastic people that were very committed to the Doherty and made it happen. The university was completely behind it. People like Jim McCluskey, hugely important in the culture of the place. And just the same on the Royal Melbourne side, we've had a number of CEOs, but each of them, I think there's been 4 over the time of the Doherty now, Shelley, Dole, and each of them very committed, even though what happens in the Institute's very far. The Dean, Jim Angus was there at the very beginning, all the deans that we've had. So we've had a lot of people, heads of all the departments, too numerous to name now. All of them were very important in the culture. Were there people that didn't buy in? Of course, there were people that didn't buy in. There were people very attached to their own histories and their own identities. And my view is bring people along. You can't always bring everyone along, and sometimes it takes time. And it has been 10 years, but the organisation has changed a lot over 10 years, and you need a little bit of patience. So in science, medicine, universities, you hear in business, CEOs come in, they fire everyone, they change the culture, new strategic plan. It doesn't happen in our world. This takes time. It's a journey.
Peter, talk us through, what were your expectations, and have they been met, exceeded? You think there's a bit more still to come? How do you see it?
I mean, my background was very different. I mean, I'm a basic scientist and known for basic science, but that's not how I started. I started as a vet. I'm the only Nobel Prize winner with a veterinary qualification. I'm the only one to have been bitten by a pig. I think I'm the only one to have my arm up the backside of about 3,000 cows. So, but I also...
Not all at the same time.
No, sequentially. And I won't go into that further. But I also started out in diagnostic pathology as well, in a state veterinary laboratory. So I was intrigued to see how it would work if we were bringing together the diagnostic, the laboratory culture, the academic, the clinical, and all the rest of it. We are a research institute, and we are a laboratory. We don't have patients within the building, though the clinical doctors who have look after the people at Royal Melbourne Hospital, the VID service, are in our institute, and it's wonderful to have them. But basically, it's been the scientific thing that's drawn it all together. And though we used to talk a lot in science about basic and applied, actually in biomedical science that's no longer true. Because what happened was, for instance, our bacterial diagnostic unit had recently been taken over by a young medical guy, Ben Howden, who didn't want a lot of bacteriology plates. Bacteriologists, you always see medical science, they're always staring down a microscope at a plate and there's spots on it. That's bacteriology, looking at spots on a plate. Ben didn't want any of that crap. He wanted big machines to do gene sequencing. He wanted to sequence every damn thing. So what did that mean? It meant the whole direction of that particular unit had changed. And then when COVID hit, they were the people who did all the sequencing, all the genomics. And that's what we saw happen through the Institute, is people switched out of what they normally did or applied what they normally did into the problem. We saw people like Tim Stanier. Tim Stanier works on the Bairnsdale ulcer, the Buruli ulcer problem, and has been responsible.
The flesh-eating ulcer.
Yeah, which is particularly problematic in the areas of Victoria. But Tim switched a lot of his effort from that study to getting a lab in a container out on the street and labs in a van, because he was particularly interested in how we were going to get the diagnostic support and so forth out into the rural communities. And that was a total switch. And we saw other people switch out of basic immunology into trying to make vaccines and so forth. Dale Godfrey, who's in the room, did that. And it was just fantastic to see people just buying into the whole thing. And that's what you need. And when Sharon talked about the cleaners and the people in the kitchen who sort of wash the glassware and all the rest of it, that's what you need in an institute, is buy-in across the board. Okay. And that's what we got. And it's just been a terrific culture and great to work in. The other thing, of course, that's so important.
I need to get back to Sharon too. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
I'll come back to you. You will get another chance, I promise you. Talk us through, because Peter mentioned COVID, and COVID is where I think in the public consciousness, suddenly the Doherty became almost like it was what was going to save us. So when you realised how bad the pandemic was going to be, and it was an epidemic, then it was a pandemic, how hard was it to crank this machine up into hyperspeed?
For short answer, it wasn't hard, because most people in the Institute live and breathe and love this stuff. You know, they're there to make a difference. They love the science, and they
love a crisis.
They love it. Doctors, scientists, they love a crisis. And the challenge was really to make sure that people weren't going to really run out of steam. That was probably the biggest challenge. But well, it unfolded quite slowly over January, and when we realised it was actually going to get very serious towards the end of January the 20th, and most of the activity at that stage was developing the right diagnostics that put us in the position to diagnose the first case of COVID, and then actually the first to grow the virus outside of China, which is what put the Doherty out in the public. That was work done by Mike Catton and Julian Druce. Mike's in the room. You saw Julian on the video. I actually at that time was in Chile, and I was on a vacation in Patagonia, and I was in a very remote part of Chile. And but I was in regular contact with Mike towards the end. And when I got back on about January the 30th, the following day, it was the day we closed our border with China. The following day, we set up a daily meeting at 8:30 till 9:15, where anyone that was working in COVID or had any knowledge of what was happening would come and meet in our boardroom. That quickly moved, of course, to Zoom. About a week in or so, I think Peter mentioned he'd like to join us, so Peter came along as well. And we met pretty much every day for most of 2020, and then it wound back a bit. We in fact had had one of those meetings just this morning, but this time it was on monkeypox, and we're ramping it up again. But but that was a very important thing to do, because every single day we had at least, it ranged between about 20 to 50 people come along to that meeting, and we would just go through all the different areas and hear everything that was happening. And of course at that time, people were accessing knowledge through all different ways. Some of it was coming out in the literature, but for many people, they were on teleconferences late at night with the WHO. They were in their flu networks hearing about it. I was in my HIV networks hearing about it. There were people sitting on government advisory committees. And it meant that all of us were hearing information from people that really knew what they were talking about.
Around the world.
Yeah, well, in the room were people within the Doherty, but they were all connected to the best
they're bringing
people.
all of that in.
So if an issue came up about schools and no one really knew what was the right thing to do about schools or not, we had people that had really given it thought, that knew the literature, that knew what was happening in England or France or Korea. And it meant that when some of us were doing media, we knew we had the latest information at our fingertips, and also could flesh out some of this within the room, not on TV, which is what I think many of us tried not to do, not to have the debate in the public, but have the debate internally.
Yeah, and it's like during a bushfire crisis, even if you don't know what's going on, you don't want the public to know you don't know, because that's part of the confidence that you want to give people that will be okay in this. Where did you learn the template that you've just told us that you applied, where did that come from? There's no guidebook. You can't take a manual off the shelf for this stuff.
Yeah, just felt like a good idea that we wanted to have one spot that everyone was bringing information to at the time. I always felt debates in public around science and policy were never good because they just make people we saw that explode in COVID, and of course that led to a lot of mistrust, and you couldn't control it, of course, because so many people had different views of it. There was no rule book. There really wasn't.
Well, there is now.
Yeah, we learned a lot.
But you've written the rule book, haven't you?
Well, that was how we did it, and it was very. It helped on so many ways. I'm just talking about communications, but it also helped on collaboration because people would describe. There were so many examples of this when these new variants were coming up, and at the beginning, people didn't really expect that we would see a lot of variation in COVID. And then one of those variants was identified in the laboratory that Peter mentioned earlier, MDU, and that was tested in a mouse model, and that it successfully infected mice. So there was just so much interaction that was happening that people were sparking ideas from each other.
I know you've written a whole book about this, Peter, and you want people to go out and get it, of course. You all will if you haven't already. But in a nutshell, what did we get right and what did we get wrong?
We're still looking at that in a sense. I think we didn't realise what this was. I mean, it was a new virus. We hadn't dealt with a virus like this before. There's a couple of coronaviruses that cause colds and flu in humans. So they're very familiar and nobody was all that interested in them because they don't create great problems. And we kept telling people right from the outset, it's not influenza. And it's not. But in fact, all the pandemic plans that were in place were for influenza. And it was a respiratory infection, so it tended to apply the influenza pandemic plan. And that wasn't totally wrong or anything, but what we didn't understand is this is a much, much more complex infection than we thought. It's not just a respiratory infection like flu, it's what we call a coagulopathy. It's a blood clotting disease, and that's a major part of the problem. This is my area of science. I'm interested in how infections work. It's called pathogenesis and how they make us sick and how we sort of try to overcome them. So we vastly underestimated this virus. The other thing is we approached the vaccine issue, and a lot of work went on, and as you know, the brilliant new innovative vaccines that weren't totally without their problems, and we understand that, and that emerged as we went through. We thought, I think, and I thought particularly, that it'd be more like an experience with a flu vaccine, and these things they're not the best vaccine in the world, but they work pretty well. And through the first year of vaccination, actually, the vaccine did work pretty well. But then this virus started to change so fast, and it's been changing so quickly that it's always ahead of the new vaccines. And so that's been a bit of a salutary lesson for those of us in the immunology space. Of course, the other thing, though, is that what's been happening over the years with antivirals is with virus infections, and it particularly came from HIV because it's been no success in making a vaccine against the AIDS virus whatsoever because of various features of that virus. But what has been an extraordinary success is the development of antiviral drugs. And that is what has kept people healthy and well, and in that community has made just such a fantastic difference. And it's an enormous triumph for human medicine and pharmacology. But what we've also realised now with viruses like COVID, we need drugs, we need therapeutics, we need small molecule chemicals. There's one available, but what happened, of course, is the fantastic donation from the Canadian philanthropist Jeff Cumming, who's given us $250 million to set up this new Institute in Therapeutics.
And we're going to raise that again from you all here tonight. Yeah. So that's
we
thought you were coming along just to have a listen to two experts.
We love people who give us a lot of money. We also love the Victorian Department because basically for a very long time now, and it's been a bipartisan policy, there's been a lot of government money put in to making Victoria the primary biomedical research city in Australia, which undoubtedly is.
And beyond Australia, also through the Asia-Pacific region, and in particular for the poorer countries in the region, Sharon, they look to you, they look to the Doherty now for leadership. Is that something you expected, or did it just suddenly happen?
It didn't just suddenly happen. There have been investments for a long time, largely through WHO, that link different parts of the region together. So we're very strongly linked to the Pacific Islands and some parts of Asia. There's been a lot of work done on influenza within the region, a lot of support for diagnostic capabilities, capacity building. So during the pandemic, yes, we supported many countries across the Pacific with their testing and their genomics, but it did build on work that had been done in influenza, work that had been done in antimicrobial resistance, big investments from the UK government that through something called the Fleming Fund, quite a lot of organic relationships as well with Vietnam and other places. So there's extensive partnerships throughout the region, but they got stronger during COVID.
And I love quoting John Howard on how those relationships happen. And it was always his great saying, you can't fatten a pig on market day. You build those relationships over time, and then when you need them, they're already there. You can't snap your finger and create them. And that comes from all the work that you'd been doing over all of those years that suddenly crystallised during COVID, is my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what, when people talk about pandemic preparedness, it is all about relationships, trust, testing systems that you can then rapidly mobilise when you've got that crisis with other countries and actually with governments as well. I think there was a lot of trust and deep expertise and relationships with both federal and state government that was also leveraged very quickly in the pandemic. You asked Peter before about what we did and what we didn't do well, but one thing that Australia did very well was react very quickly and with great concern around the pandemic. And one of my favourite lines from Helen Clark when she has done an analysis of what the world did during the pandemic was that February was a lost month for the world, which is very, very true. So, but in Australia, in February, the government was already taking this very seriously. And of course we didn't do perfectly. There was the Ruby Princess and a number of different things that went bad. But what we did do was set up testing very, very quickly and took the challenge very, very seriously with public health measures. And that stopped that exponential growth of infections back in February 2020 when we had nothing that we could give people at that time.
Really quick, simple question, which probably isn't simple, but it's easy to say it. Why do some people recover and others get long COVID? Are we any closer to understanding that?
I think we've got more and more understanding. Without a doubt, if you have more severe infection, you're more likely to get long-term symptoms. If you have milder infection, you're less likely. That's similar to what we've seen with other respiratory infectious diseases when you're very, very sick.
So is that to do with your immune system before you get sick, what state it's in?
Largely because when you're very sick and you're in intensive care, your immune system is hyperstimulated and overactive, and it stays overactive for a longer period of time, and that probably gives you the prolonged fatigue. Why otherwise completely healthy people who have mild disease ultimately get long COVID is not well understood. There are some theories that you have bits of the virus that hangs around in your gut and therefore it's constantly stimulating the immune system. There's probably a genetic predisposition, but that hasn't been shown. It's a very difficult thing to study because it's very diverse. People have different types of long COVID and it's a very hard thing to really characterise. But we will learn a lot. Many viruses give you chronic fatigue or post-viral fatigue or post-infectious fatigue syndromes, and we've never really understood it very well. But I think with the amount of investment that's going in now, we will get a really good insight into understanding this.
Okay, we're getting to the point where we do want to invite some questions from the floor in a few minutes, so you might want to give some thought to what you want to ask either of our superstars up here on the stage. But there's some other important things we need to deal with before we get there. Doherty Clinical Trials is a new venture. Talk us through. It will come as no news to lots of people here, but it will come as news to others. So let's not assume prior knowledge. What is it? How's it going to work?
Doherty Clinical Trials Limited is a private company owned by University of Melbourne that focuses completely on phase 1, early phase studies to get better treatments and vaccines for infectious diseases, largely using human infection challenge. And what that is where you can safely give volunteers an infection such as malaria or certain types of bacteria or certain viruses and test whether a therapeutic or a vaccine works. And early in 2020, we recruited a world leader on human infection challenge for malaria. That's James McCarthy, to be head of the Victorian Infectious Diseases Service. And part of the discussions with James were that we were going to set up a human infection challenge model system. And it took us a bit of time, but we got there. And now it's opened up. It has an independent board. Many of our board members are here today, a CEO, Andrew Brockway. And we're going to do challenges for malaria, challenge infection for influenza, the first in Australia, for gonorrhea, and for a type of bacteria, group A strep. And it's a very powerful way to very rapidly see whether a vaccine or a therapeutic works, because you don't have to do it in the field, you can do it in this controlled setting.
And the Cumming Centre, so a $250 million philanthropic gift from Jeff Cumming, and you've got to work out what to spend it on.
Well, no, we've got a very clear plan of what to spend it on. So that was another incredible outcome from COVID. I should also say, even before this amazing gift, we saw some incredible generosity from the community during COVID. Many people here who actually gave the Doherty Institute money very early on made a huge difference to what we could do. The Jack Ma Foundation, the Kim Wright Foundation, there were many that gave us millions of dollars very early on. Jeff's gift was very carefully designed together with Jeff around what we could do. The main goal for Jeff was to establish a centre or to establish the capability that would put us in a totally different position should we have a pandemic in 20 years than what happened in 2020. That was the underlying sort of premise of the centre. And
again, easy to say, but hard to do.
Yeah, but what Jeff challenged us to think in the future, what would you like to have in 20 years that you didn't have now? And Jeff was introduced to us by Jim Angus, sitting here at the front. And we did a lot of discussions internally about it. But one thing we didn't have, and we didn't have quickly, was really good therapeutics. Peter touched on this before. We had the fact that we had a vaccine not only discovered and worked, but rolled out within 11 months of the pandemic was extraordinary. And that's because a lot of investment over the last 5 to 10 years has gone into what's called platform technologies for vaccines, new technologies like mRNA that you develop for malaria, but then you can rapidly shift to a new pathogen. And therapeutics, we use a different tactic. Every single infection has its own unique targeted treatment. So we want to develop platforms that can give you treatments at a much quicker speed. Because the gap we had was on therapeutics. We got diagnostics quickly, we got vaccines quickly, but we took about 2 years to get therapeutics like Paxlovid, and they're pretty shitty drugs, actually. They're not as good as we'd like.
It's a technical term. Yeah. So, Peter, as much as anything in your senior years, you've been a science communicator. Where did that knack come from? Because you can break down the complexity to the point where even someone who's struggled in fifth form science can understand it.
Well, I do have some Irish ancestry, and it is said that everyone is issued with a certain number of words, and when you use them all, you die. But I think the Irish get twice as many. So I got dumped into public science communication, not so much by the Nobel Prize, but which puts you in the public area, because once you win a Nobel Prize, you know everything, or that's the perception. But by the fact that though I was living in Memphis, Tennessee, under the rules that then applied, I was made the Australian of the Year. It wasn't a Miss America contest like we've got now that's supervised by the Prime Minister. It was a group of guys sitting around in Sydney with a couple of bottles of Grange, and the sooner they got the decision out of the way, the sooner they could drink. And so if you won a Nobel Prize, you were it. So, but as a result of that, living in the US, I was coming back to Australia right through 1997, and we came back 3 or 4 times, I think, and talking in all the capital cities. And that put me on the public stage. And, you know, I'm used to talking to other scientists. I can communicate really well. But suddenly, talking to the broader public, you have to learn a whole lot of new skills very, very quickly. And it turned out I am reasonably okay at it. And then also I started to write books. I mean, nobody much reads books, but it helped me to organise my thinking and so forth. And I was interviewed many times by Jon Faine, which was wonderful.
That's a low light, yeah.
So I'm still struggling with this. I mean, how do we communicate ideas, the importance of evidence, the importance of an evidence-based world? And if you look, for instance, the American election that's upcoming, you realise that at least 50% of the American citizenry and voters have no interest in evidence at all, because they could vote for Donald Trump, which seems almost unbelievable. But
so both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have got a mention tonight.
But I am suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, actually. The guy is in my head like one of those little worms. But Kennedy actually had a worm in his head, didn't he?
Yeah, well.
Yeah, so I've stopped tweeting as a result. But
Peter Doherty will be opening the Comedy Festival next April. And I reckon you'd be filling the halls. You absolutely would. But in fact, it's that humility that you have. Obviously, the self-deprecation is endearing.
Well,
but it comes with an integrity and an authenticity that underpins the message. It's a very special combination that you put together.
As you know, John, I think one of the main things in this is a sense of respect. Respect for the people you're talking to and trying to get to what they want. Because it's not about you telling people things, it's about you trying to explain, to show, actually, not to tell.
Yep.
That was what was so challenging, social media, wasn't it? I mean, Peter,
still is.
Peter, the way you interacted with the public and the usual approach just doesn't work on social media, does it? It was really sad to see.
Twitter actually worked very well because a lot of scientists were on Twitter and they were using it. A lot of people, for instance, if I'm trying to find out, I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't tell people what they should do unless I can say this is what this medical group says or this medical college says or whatever. And apart from that, talk to your doctor. But what was happening on Twitter is a lot of people were using it they would become read up and fully cognizant with or seeing a lot of patients, and then they would put a thread up. And so gynecologists trying to find out what really is the advice for pregnant women, you would get fantastic information.
Okay.
That's all been totally ruined by Musk, who's driven people off. And
that's next week's topic.
Made it into a...
Okay, now I'm an auctioneer on a Saturday afternoon around the neighbourhood looking for hands to go up. And if you've got questions, I'll take them in the order that I see them, and I'll come to you in a moment. My final question, though, Sharon, is a personal one. Do you really work 32 hours a day? 9 days a week? It seems
Definitely
that
not.
way.
Definitely not.
But how do you handle the pressure?
Well, I'm pretty good at turning off, I'll be honest. When I need to turn off, I can turn off. I work a lot at nights, but I don't send emails overnight. That is a very good lesson because it means that you don't get the emails coming straight back to you, and trying to send them during working hours. I think I just grew up not taking myself too seriously, and so just kind of turning off when I have to. That's really how I manage it.
Yep. I mean, Sharon is enormously successful because she trusts her senior colleagues and she appoints good people. And, the worst thing you can have in head of a university, a prime minister, president is someone who micromanages. It's a total disaster. So you have to trust people and you have to appoint good people. That's the secret of running anything, isn't it, really? Yeah.
Yes, and not everyone gets it. We've got so many more questions I've got on the list that I prepared, and I've got halfway through mine, but it's time for your questions as well. I've got one, I'm looking for more, looking for advances. If we'll start over there, and I'll look for hands as we go.
Hi. Hi, it's Ricky Spencer. I'm on the CAC board, CAB, sorry, Doherty Consumer Group. I'm a health sociologist, so I'm really interested in the changing landscape that I've seen where everyday people have sort of got an insight into what immunisation is, and they have a bit more of an understanding now. How do we keep that from dissipating or waiting 20 years? Because I know in our space that we've created here, we're very passionate about encouraging the communities to really stay and work in partnership and really be up to date, learning about, you know, being immunisation, especially me coming from stolen generation, about breaching mob, so that's one. And my other little bit to throw at you, I'm also interested, I keep getting asked questions about data sovereignty and all the work that immunologists do at the Doherty. How do you ensure that you take into account when you're looking and researching with our DNA and respectfully working with us to ensure that?
Okay. Peter, do you want to go first? And then the DNA part I'll throw to Sharon.
Yes, the community is much more informed about the nature of vaccination, the importance of vaccination, but of course we also have, and this is a function of social media and the World Wide Web and so forth, and this is the first pandemic where we've had that out there. I mean, the previous HIV/AIDS pandemic in the 1980s, of course, none of that existed. So we've also got tremendous misinformation, hostility, groups getting together and coming up with all sorts of weirdness. But I think you're right. Across the broader community, there is that appreciation. Of course, to some extent, the COVID vaccines have been a problem because though they certainly saved a lot of lives, particularly early on, they don't prevent infection. That's an issue. And that, of course, feeds into narratives that about vaccination are not very positive. But, you know, a lot of our vaccines are really fantastic vaccines. Polio vaccine, measles vaccine, whooping cough vaccine. I mean, denying those to a child is really a disaster, and yet more and more people are. So we have big problems. About data security, I think Sharon...
I'll answer that question. Thanks, Ricky. It's a great question about how we regulate research, I guess, and particularly very important issues like someone's DNA, genetic code. Well, it actually is a very highly regulated process. We can't work on people's blood and tissues without consent and without an ethics committee providing that consent, and particularly if you're working with DNA, it has an extra level of consent. So I think people should be reassured that any work with human material comes under an ethics framework, and but then newer technologies come along. So you talked about DNA, but what does that mean for other components of a cell like RNA? But it is a very regulated process, and that's our responsibility to work within that ethical framework.
And that ethical framework is public and it's transparent and everyone knows how it works. Next question's just here.
You were looking for hands and you found Hans. I'm a mechanical engineer. Peter, you mentioned cat ladies. I'm not going to mention that person's name, and there's another name I'm not going to mention either. But you can do the best science, but at the end of the day, it sort of comes to packaging as well. In the US during COVID, a certain person managed to weaponise masks, which I thought was amazing.
Yeah.
If you come up with really good vaccines or whatever, I'm just trying to imagine what people like that will do with, you know, injecting stuff into people. If they can do that with masks, what will they do with that? So how do you manage that? Because that,
I
to me,
don't know. There was a lot of weirdness. I mean, some places in Florida banning masks and so forth. Crazy stuff. And that is really, social media really feeds this so effectively. Then, of course, when you've got an American president who suggests maybe you should drink bleach, I mean, you've got a bit of a problem. So really, I must say, I think we handled it really well. And I think we were lucky to have a very competent federal health minister in Greg Hunt, and I think our public health mechanisms work well. I'd wondered, the CDC, the American system, it has the United States Public Health Service. It's a federal service. It's actually a commissioned corps, equivalent to the Navy or the Army. They're required to wear a uniform occasionally. We actually perform better than the CDC for various reasons. And they got some things wrong. They'd also had some very significant financial cuts under Trump and so forth. One of the things that we have to do is make sure the politicians realise that the funding has to stay up there for public health. We saw Campbell Newman cut public health severely in Queensland some years back. Fortunately, they didn't get too bad an experience during the pandemic. But this is dangerous. You have to keep that competence and that commitment in these communities, because you never know when these things will hit. And I think it is an absolute dead cert we're going to have other severe pandemics. Why do I think that? Because of the size of the human population, because of the increasing prosperity in areas like China, which has people getting on jets, flying all over the world, and this is where people and wild animals and so forth are very close. And I think that's the explanation for COVID, and I think we'll have more of these experiences. And I think COVID has actually been a very good training run for us.
Thank you. Just on the aisle there, yes.
Yes, thank you. Rowan Martires with the Ian Potter Foundation, which is very pleased to be supporting the Doherty and the Coming Centre as well. Thanks for talking about some of the key factors over the last 10 years, the culture, and also how some of the Parkville precinct has organically involved. Separate from, I'm wanting to hear a bit more about the future, and perhaps this is for Sharon. Over the next 10 years, separate from funding, for example, which Peter just talked about, what do you see as some of the key decisions that I guess the Institute and the wider ecosystem will need to make now that the Institute's of national and international importance? What are some of those key decisions or challenges?
Do you mean scientific decisions?
No, I guess I'm talking about
strategic.
To support strategic and to support the broader ecosystem.
Okay, thank you.
That you and the ecosystem will have to make.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. Great question. I'll just highlight two. We haven't yet talked about the AIID, the Australian Institute for Infectious Disease, an extraordinary opportunity to not only give the Doherty 50% more space, but to bring the Burnett alongside us to create this new institute, which will be a third of the building, the Doherty, a third the Burnett, and a third the University of Melbourne. And the vision is to greatly strengthen collaboration and intersection with academia and industry. So the university space will largely be for small biotech and industry. And I think that is what we learnt during COVID, that exactly about the pig story, which was a good one, about these relationships that you are very, very established during peacetime that can rapidly adapt. So that's a huge opportunity for us, of course, supported by the Victorian government with $400 million, state-of-the-art technology, will triple our high containment capabilities, give us a new clinical trial unit, robotic biobanking. And the second thing is to connect us regionally, nationally, regionally, and globally. And I think all of those relationships not only will enhance the science that everyone's doing, not just on pandemics, of course. We work on other things, fundamental questions about the immune system and how it handles cancer or transplantation or autoimmunity and better diagnostics and therapeutics. We want to be partnering nationally, and I think we need to do a lot better how we work as a nation. COVID made us a bit parochial. we all kind of looked inwards within our own states, and our public health systems are a little bit, they separate us a bit, but hopefully with the Australian CDC we'll get better at collaborating nationally. Got so much to do regionally. Our region is a mix of extremely high income countries and extremely low income. And then partnering. I want to partner with similar sorts of institutes in the world. We're currently in advanced discussions with Oxford, who have set up a very similar institute to us, the Pandemic Science Institute. So I think there's huge opportunities for us going forward. And I think we've learnt with COVID that we need those partnerships highly functional and working when we've got the time to make them work.
I have quite a long list and there's hands still going up. I'm not sure I'm going to get to you all, but right at the back on the aisle there, thank you.
I also have a future-oriented question for you, Sharon, which is in relation to the thoughtful culture that you've built over the first 10 years. I'm curious about what you think the culture will need to look like for the next 10 years and beyond.
Well, that's a tricky question because I think history plays an important role in culture. And of course, many of the great leaders within the Institute were there at the beginning building this culture. And then now you've got a whole nother dimension and a much bigger entity with other neighbours and partners, the AID, etc. I think we just stick to the fundamentals that we know that work, which means we want to create an enabling environment for people to do the best work possible and always be thinking about the impact, why we're doing what we're doing. Thinking always about the important partnerships, not just between ourselves, but with other similar entities, with governments, etc. So I think the fundamentals are always the same, but there's significant challenges based on size once we get a lot bigger.
Yeah, and the other thing is I'm old, but the thing
Microphone.
The thing about the Institute is we're constantly bringing in young people to train, and young people to leadership positions, or at a junior level that will work up into leadership positions. It's enormously important to have this turnover. We've already seen some of our very effective group leaders through COVID take senior positions elsewhere, back in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and so forth. And that flow through, that turnover, is what keeps institutions like this dynamic and really works well. The other thing that's really come through for me from this, and I've been committed to this for some time, I spent a lot of my life working in research institutes, is the enormous importance of the modern university, the research university. And we're not the only one in Victoria that's really terrific. I mean, Monash is great. We've got great things going on in Deakin and La Trobe and all sorts of things. So it's not unique to Melbourne, but that we have this cluster. But the university that has all this spectrum of expertise, we can draw on the engineers. One of our leading lights actually is in the engineering faculty. He's a modeller. We can draw on the pharmacy college down the street. Fantastic institution, part of Monash University, but we collaborate well with them. We collaborate very well with Monash University, kind of interchange. So the importance of the research universities. We have to keep our universities strong because governments can buy into universities, philanthropists can buy into universities, and there's no political barrier, if you like. And that's really important. Keep our higher education, our research sector strong.
I've got several more questions, but on that point, really briefly, Sharon, talent retention and talent recruitment. How important is that?
Oh, absolutely fundamental to the success. As we said on the video, what Peter's been saying, it's all about people, about renewal, about enabling people to be their very best, and that's all about recruitment. But people leave. Science is a very big international effort, and we should always see that as a positive and maintain that relationship with people that leave. And the constant challenge for recruitment, although we're recruiting to a wonderful city, an amazing institution, an amazing university, we haven't had too much problem bringing people in, but retaining them is always a challenge.
We've had Brexit refugees, Trump refugees, gun culture refugees, and that's across the university, not just in medicine and science.
Exactly.
It's extraordinary.
But it's your colleagues. You need funding. Funding is enormously important. It's like the Willie Sutton. You know Willie Sutton? He was an American bank robber. And he became a kind of society figure in New York after he got out of jail. And a lady asked him at one of those New York cocktail parties, why do you rob banks, Mr. Sutton? He said, lady, that's where the money is. And basically, you need money. I mean, this is a very, very expensive activity.
Yeah.
But the other thing is your colleagues are incredibly important. I mean, I spent 14 years of my life in Memphis, Tennessee. Why? Because I had fantastic colleagues in an institution that brought in more than $1 billion a year in public donations.
Jeremy.
Wonderful institution.
Jeremy.
Thank you. Jeremy Moore, the Secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet. But before being in this role, I spent the second half of 2020 seeing Sharon a lot on the screen because I was in the Department of Health supporting COVID response. A couple of comments, if I may, briefly, John, and then a question to Sharon. I got to meet Jeff Cumming and spend some time with him as he was finalising his decision and through the introductions that you made. And the amount of time that he had spent deciding where to put his money globally and deciding to bring it here is a great credit to you and your colleagues, because that's, I mean, it's a huge gift, and it was, you know, in the wind, it could have gone anywhere, and he chose to bring it here. Secondly, you haven't really spoken about this, but the value of the predictive modelling that Doherty did during COVID, testing what ultimately became decisions about which levers to pull and what to do, and what the effect of that might be, the accuracy of that was incredible, and really assisted in the response decisions that were made here and elsewhere, because I know you were supporting government at national level and in other jurisdictions as well. My question is about, you must have been inundated by government requests. I mean, I know how much we looked towards you during that time, but I know that you were getting requests from others as well. I mean, what did that feel like? Because I know you have a relationship with governments and you work with people in a sort of a more non-crisis environment, but the ramp up during that period and the amount of times that you personally, you know, very late at night, were joining meetings that I was in, it was quite remarkable.
Well,
if you'd like to come up here, Jeremy, I've got quite a few questions I'd like to ask you too.
I'll just thank you, Jeremy. Just a brief answer. We actually had many people across the institution that had very good established relationships with government, and they had been built over years before in other outbreaks that were never the size of COVID, and of course with influenza. The modelling work, and I can see Jodie McBurnan up the back, was really built on a very long, decades of engagement with government around modelling in other diseases and trust. There was a great amount of trust, and it really did, as you said, helped policy enormously. I think, and we had similar sorts of relationships with the diagnostic labs, because through public health are part of a larger network that feed into government decision making. I think on a personal level, I had done quite a lot of work with governments through my HIV work, and I think for many people it gave them a great sense of importance of the work that they were doing, that their work that they're passionate about, that they get up every day. They work really 24/7. Most scientists love their stuff that they're doing. It's not even work, it's their real passion and joy. And then you have a policy maker that's really interested. It gave people an incredible, I think it was incredibly inspiring for people in their work. So yes, it was exhausting and pressured and at different times was difficult. But in the end, I think it gave great meaning to people about the work that they do.
We've got time for one more question. Yes.
Russell Bassett, board of DCT, but during the pandemic, as you know, Sharon, I was at CSL's vaccine arm in the research group. I guess the question to how you see the future and how well the world's responding to the pandemic that we've experienced, and are we more acutely, is the world, Australia, global coordination, more acutely tuned into the possibility of the flu pandemic or whatever's next, or is there a bit of stitch and people's attention and dollars, as Peter's alluding to, are more challenging to get?
Well, I think we've learnt a lot, and there are things that we would do much quicker now. There are things that we probably couldn't do now because the public have very strong views on what they will and won't do. So some of the things we did, I think, will be much harder to implement. I think there's an incredible amount of fatigue and probably trauma related to COVID, and other problems have taken over. And I don't think I think we are, and I'm generally an optimistic person, I think we are in a better place than we were before, but we've got a long way to go. And I think we can see signs of that by how we're responding to new challenges that are coming out. So Mpox is a really great example. The big problem with Mpox right now is that it's spreading through Central Africa and they don't have access to a vaccine. Well, we talked for ages about vaccine supply, how you mobilise, how you move vaccines to low middle income countries, and we're not doing it right now. And we're going to face a lot of infectious diseases challenges that might not be like COVID, where they affect every single person on the planet to the same extent. But the ones that affect unique groups of populations are just as important. And there is fatigue there, and there's competition. So I think on the one hand, we have learnt an incredible amount. COVID itself has taught us so much about a whole range of different disciplines. But we have to really make sure that people don't settle back into complacency, and that the work that you do in peacetime really pays off. And I think the world's got a lot more to do, and now's not the time to withdraw funding, etc. So we've got to keep up the buy-in into the need for that.
We're out of time, but Peter, very, very briefly and finally, over your working life, infectious disease research has gone from being the poor relation, and in a way, I mean, it wasn't very important. It was regarded as a sort of, a bit of a backwater, to now being the most important area of medical research. Do you think that's permanent now?
Yes, I think we are confronted by this very large human population that's under increasing stress, increasing food stress, increasing stress from climate change in all sorts of ways, travelling all over the place. I think infectious diseases are going to be with us a long time. But, I mean, people were saying, senior scientists were saying, Macfarlane Burnett said it in the 60s, the era of infectious disease is over. Well, then we got HIV/AIDS, COVID, and what else? We have multi-drug resistant bacteria. We have very few drugs in the pipeline because of, first, say, tuberculosis, many of the bacterial infections that worry us so much in hospitals. There are various levels to this. I mean, partly because a lot of that is commercially driven, and I think we have to some extent, find another way of doing this. And the Cummings Centre is one of them for antivirals. I think also for antibacterials. There's not a lot of money for drug companies and antibiotics. That's a problem. The money is in things like statins that you have to take every day, but not in things like antibiotics. In some ways, the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, or Bill and now Melinda separately, have put a lot of money into this, but it needs more than that. We need a much greater sense that government is important. I mean, we've had the Americans particularly under crazy setup in Britain with terrible people in government, basically, and running against government for years. We have to realise the importance of government, the importance of the public good, and the importance of a community, a global community, because when it comes to a pandemic, we're a global community.
And a big shout out to Boris as well. Look, it's been absolutely fantastic. We have run out of time, and there's still lots of hands going up. And I want to thank everybody for coming along, and I want to thank you, and of course you to thank Sharon Lewin and Peter Doherty for their generosity of spirit and their leadership on this absolutely vital area of research. And I now get to ask you all to wish the Doherty Institute a very happy 10th birthday. Hip hip. Hooray! Hip hip. Hooray! Hip hip. Hooray! Yay, there we are. A final sobering thought though. Progress is neither inevitable nor linear. It doesn't just move smoothly along a line. And it doesn't happen unless you make it happen. And we have seen that in recent years with our very own eyes, and it is exemplified by the work that's been done by all the people involved at every level of the Doherty. So a big thank you, as Peter and Sharon have both said, from the people who clean the floors through to the people who are on the board and everybody in between, people who stare down a microscope and people who do the payroll, because it wouldn't happen without everybody. And that leadership and that culture, it goes from the top, but it also comes upwards organically from below. So a big cheerio, a big shout out and a big thank you from the people of Victoria, Australia, the world, to the work being done at the Doherty, and may the next 10 and the 10 after that be just as wonderful and as fabulous. It's been a really interesting evening, and we've laughed. Thank you, Peter. And we've learned. Thank you, Sharon. No, both of you have made us laugh and learn, and that's been fabulous. Now, for those of you who are invited to stay on for the reception, that's over through the doors to your left. For everybody else, I'm sorry there isn't room for all of you, but thank you very much for coming along. A big thank you to the events team at the Doherty who have put this together seamlessly. And thank you all very much for coming along, and good evening.
That you